Imagine a multinational corporation,
Okay.
and it has millions of highly dedicated employees. It's got operations in basically every country on earth, billions of dollars in real estate, annual revenue, and like this level of brand loyalty that corporate executives could literally only dream of.
Right, the holy grail of branding.
Exactly. But now imagine that this exact same corporation
Wow.
has no centralized headquarters,
None at all.
no CEO, no board of directors. There is no central human resources department handing down a standardized manual of operations to everyone.
Which sounds like a total logistical nightmare.
It really does. I mean, it should inevitably collapse into total chaos within a week, right?
Absolutely, it should just splinter.
And yet, not only does it survive, but it is currently like one of the fastest growing global cultural forces of the modern era.
Yeah, it really is the ultimate paradox of organizational structure, because when you study massive historical movements, whether we're talking about the Roman Empire or, the expansion of the East India Company or an ancient religious institution like the Catholic Church, you invariably find a map.
Right, there's a clear flow chart.
Exactly. You find a rigid hierarchy, you've got an emperor, a monarch, or a pope, and this very thick rule book dictating exactly how the central nervous system controls the outer limbs of the body. But the movement we are looking at today completely shatters that traditional model.
Which brings us to today's topic. Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we are taking a massive stack of research, historical data, and sociological analysis, and we are unpacking the history, the theology, and the absolutely staggering global rise of non-denominational and evangelical Christianity.
It is a massive topic.
It is. And the mission for us today, and for you listening, is to decode this mystery. Like, how does a movement with zero central authority manage to scale the entire globe?
Well, to understand how they pulled this off, you have to fundamentally shift your perspective.
How so?
Because if you examine this movement expecting to find a traditional institution, you will just be deeply confused. The secret to decoding this is to look past the idea of religion as a rigid bureaucracy.
Okay.
You have to start viewing it as this highly adaptable, fiercely independent, and profoundly emotionally driven community. I mean, it functions much more like a modern tech startup than a medieval kingdom.
The startup, I like that.
Yeah, and its entire operational model is fixated on one primary thing, which is personal, individual transformation.
And there's this brilliant analogy in the research that I think perfectly captures this energy.
Oh, the music analogy.
Yeah, it suggests that if you want to understand the creative and emotional DNA of this non-denominational movement, you really shouldn't compare it to like a grand ancient symphony playing in a cathedral.
Right.
You should compare it to a freestyle rap cipher.
That analogy is sociologically spot on. It completely reframes how you look at the energy of the movement.
It really does.
Because if you look at the traditional high church environment, say, Catholicism operates like orchestral boom bap.
Right.
It has massive production value, centuries of historical samples that are meticulously arranged, and a conductor ensuring everyone plays exactly the right note at exactly the right time.
Right, you don't just improvise in a cathedral.
No, absolutely not. And then you have the Eastern Orthodox tradition, which feels like ancient choir chants layered over this deep, resonant, historical base.
So evangelicalism.
Yes.
It is pure freestyle cipher energy.
Yes.
It's an open mic in a crowded room. It relies so heavily on personal testimony. Like everyone in the circle is rapping about the exact same central figure, Jesus,
Yeah.
but the beats, the rhythm, the emotional inflection, and the delivery are completely localized.
It's entirely personal.
Exactly. It's raw.
But that raw grassroots energy didn't just appear out of nowhere.
Right.
To understand how this modern, highly decentralized startup-style religion operates today, we have to look at the original disruptors.
We have to go back.
We do. We have to rewind the tape and examine the people who essentially broke away from the massive institutional monopolies of their time.
Okay, let's unpack this history. Because for you listening, it's important to realize these modern independent churches didn't just drop out of the sky with acoustic guitars and projection screens.
Yeah, they definitely did not.
They are the result of a centuries-long chain reaction of rebellion against bureaucracy. So think about this like a corporate history, where the middle management became so bloated, so corrupt, and so slow that the people on the ground staged a massive walkout.
That's a great way to put it.
Right. If traditional historical denominations were these massive corporate hierarchies, the people in this movement essentially wanted to cut out all the bureaucratic middlemen. They wanted a direct, unmediated line to the CEO.
And that walkout officially began in the 1500s with the Protestant Reformation.
Ah, Martin Luther.
Exactly. You have to put yourself in the shoes of someone living in Europe at that time. The church was not just a spiritual entity. It was a sprawling, massively wealthy political powerhouse.
It was basically the government in a lot of ways.
It really was. It was intertwined with state governments, featuring immense bureaucracies and total gatekeeping over who could access God, how they could do it, and even in what language they could read the sacred texts.
Right, because the texts were in Latin, which normal people couldn't read, so they practically had a monopoly on the divine.
A literal monopoly.
If you wanted forgiveness, you had to go through their designated representatives, perform their specific rituals, and, sometimes even pay for the privilege through things like indulgences.
Yes. So when Martin Luther and the early reformers stepped up, it was this initial earth-shattering fracture. They looked at this massive apparatus and said, this entire structure is unnecessary for salvation.
Boo.
Right. That was the foundational act of cutting out middle management. But the Reformation was only step one.
Because they just built new hierarchies.
Exactly. While it broke the monopoly of the Catholic Church, the early Protestant movements, like the Lutherans and the Anglicans, they still created their own state-sponsored institutions. They built new, albeit slightly different, bureaucracies.
Right, so they replaced the Pope with a king or a council, but you still had a very formal, rigid, top-down structure. The true cipher energy, that street-level, emotional, highly personalized religion that doesn't really ignite until you get to the 1700s and 1800s, right? With the evangelical revivals.
Yes. This is a crucial turning point. This period is often called the Great Awakenings. You have figures like John Wesley and George Whitefield, and their methodology was completely radical for the time.
What were they doing differently?
Well, they looked at the formal, quiet, highly structured parish churches where, a highly educated priest would read a dry theological essay to a very sleepy congregation, and they said, this is dead.
Wow.
So they took the message out of the buildings entirely.
We went rogue.
Completely rogue. They started preaching in open fields. They went to the literal streets, preaching to thousands of coal miners in England who were literally covered in soot.
That's incredible imagery.
Or to factory workers and farmers in the American colonies. And the entire emphasis of the religion shifted dramatically in that exact moment.
How so?
It was no longer about, are you showing up to the correct building and participating in the proper institutional rituals? The new question was, have you had a personal conversion experience?
Oh, I see.
Right. Has your heart actually tangibly changed?
And you can draw a direct, unbroken line from those coal miners crying in an open field in the 1700s right to a modern megachurch in Texas today.
Absolutely.
But the massive explosion of this specific non-denominational model where churches severed ties with historic labels completely, that really caught fire in the United States much later, right? Like in the mid to late 20th century, right after the 1950s.
Yeah, the sociological climate in post-war America was just the perfect incubator for this.
Why the 50s?
Well, you had immense economic growth, the rise of the suburbs, a booming middle class, and crucially, a culture that increasingly valued individual choice and consumerism.
The American Dream era.
Exactly. In that environment, people started looking around at all the different Protestant denominations, the Baptists, the Methodists, the Presbyterians, the Episcopalians, and they started asking a very pragmatic question.
Right. They asked, why are we divided over all these hyper-specific, centuries-old bureaucratic rules?
Why does it matter?
Why does it matter if we sprinkle water or dunk people? Why does it matter what type of robe the pastor wears? Why can't we just have a simple, unified Christianity?
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, that desire for simplicity created what the sources call the Great Remix.
Okay, break that down for us.
When you look at the landscape of modern non-denominational churches today, they might have a sleek, modern logo. They might have a casual, inviting name like Grace City or Oasis Church. They explicitly claim no affiliation with historic top-down traditions. That is their new branding. But if you look at their actual theology,
It's all old material.
it is entirely built on old samples.
It's a massive theological mashup.
It really is. Let's break down the tracks they are sampling. First, they pull heavily from the Baptist tradition, specifically the concept of believer's baptism.
Okay.
Historically, most traditions baptized infants as a way of initiating them into the community right from birth. The non-denominational movement adopted the Baptist view. You aren't born into this. You must actively, consciously choose it as an adult, and then you get baptized.
So that's track one. Individual choice.
Exactly. Track 2 sample is the Methodist tradition. That is the intense personal revivalism we just talked about with John Wesley, the idea that faith must be a deeply felt personal awakening, not just, intellectual agreement.
Right. It has to hit the heart.
Track 3 pulls from the Pentecostal tradition, which emerged a bit later in the early 1900s. This brought in the highly expressive, physically engaging, emotional worship styles.
Like raising hands and dynamic music.
Raising hands, dynamic music, a belief that the Holy Spirit is actively moving in the room.
Okay, so we have choice, emotion, and expression. What's the fourth track?
Underneath all of that emotional and expressive energy, they need a solid structural foundation. And the research points out this is often quietly pulled from Reformed theology.
Oh, okay.
This provides their foundational understanding of the nature of God, the severity of human sin, and the actual mechanics of how salvation works.
So you mix those four historical samples together, put a modern, accessible brand on it, and you have the modern non-denominational church.
Not too much.
But a mashup that complex doesn't just spontaneously organize itself. Like, it needed someone to act as the primary DJ. It needed someone to standardize the mix and broadcast it to the masses.
And that brings us to arguably the most important figure in 20th century Protestant history.
Billy Graham.
Yes, Billy Graham. If you want to understand why evangelicalism is a cohesive global force today rather than 1,000 splintered, squabbling factions, you have to look at Graham's logistical genius.
He was the linchpin, wasn't he?
He absolutely was. Before him, you had all these disparate groups we just mentioned, and they did not always get along.
Right.
The Pentecostals thought the Reformed folks were entirely too rigid and intellectual. The Baptists were skeptical of the Methodists. But Graham came along in the mid-20th century and essentially served as a unifying diplomat.
How did he do that?
He launched these massive stadium crusades. We're talking events that required unprecedented levels of logistical organization, marketing, and cross-denominational cooperation.
I mean, we are talking about packing out Madison Square Garden for 16 consecutive weeks in 1957.
It's unbelievable.
Hundreds of thousands of people. And to get all these different churches to cooperate and send their people to these stadiums, Graham had to boil the theology down to its absolute simplest, most universally agreeable form.
Yes, and that process of simplification codified what it means to be a modern evangelical. Graham stripped away all the denominational specificities.
He got rid of the arguments.
He did. He said, it doesn't matter how your church governs itself or what historical creeds you recite. What matters are three core pillars.
Which are?
First, you must have a personal conversion experience. Second, you must view the Bible as the ultimate infallible authority. And third, you have a strict obligation to share this message with the world, which is mass evangelism.
Okay, let's look at the mechanics of that second pillar, because this is where the entire system gets incredibly fascinating to me.
The Bible as authority.
Right. You strip away the historical bureaucracy. You cut out the middle management of priests, saints, bishops, and popes. But if you remove all of that structural human authority, you cannot just leave a vacuum.
Nature abhors a vacuum.
Exactly. You need something to hold the millions of people together. You need a central unifying code.
Yeah.
And for this movement, that code became the text itself, the Bible.
The theological term for this operating system is sola scriptura, which translates directly from Latin as scripture alone.
Scripture alone.
And to truly grasp how radical this is, you have to contrast it with the older, more centralized traditions. Think about how authority functions in the Catholic Church.
Okay.
It operates like a three-legged stool. The first leg's of the Bible. The second leg is the sacred tradition of the church, the accumulated historical teachings of the centuries.
Right.
And the third leg is the magisterium, which is the living teaching authority of the Pope and the bishops.
So you need all three legs for the stool to stand. If you have a question about what a Bible verse means, the church tradition and the Pope give you the definitive unified answer.
Precisely. You don't guess. And the Eastern Orthodox tradition operates similarly, relying on the Bible interpreted strictly through ancient church councils and the writings of the early church fathers.
But the evangelical and non-denominational model takes a chainsaw to two of those legs.
A total chainsaw. They look at the text and declare that the Bible is the ultimate, final, and only infallible authority.
Period. End of discussion.
Exactly. If a church tradition, a historical council, or a modern bishop contradicts their independent reading of the Bible, the tradition is instantly discarded.
Which is wild when you think about it.
It is, and this absolute reliance on the text is why modern, highly accessible translations of the Bible are the absolute lifeblood of their culture. You see translations like the New International Version, the NIV, or the English Standard Version, the ESV, dominating the space.
Because it has to be readable.
Right. The text has to be entirely understandable to a normal, modern reader because that reader is expected to sit down, read it, interpret it, and build their life upon it without a priest doing the heavy intellectual lifting for them.
And when they read that text, they extract a very specific psychological worldview that defines the human experience for them.
Yes.
It's this dualistic view of humanity. On one hand, they believe humans possess profound inherent dignity because they are created in the image of the divine, the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.
Right, the image of God.
But on the other hand, that dignity is severely compromised by a deep inherited moral brokenness, which is the concept of sin.
And in this framework, the ultimate purpose of human life isn't just to be a good person or to follow a generic list of moral rules or, to simply achieve earthly happiness.
Right, it goes deeper than that.
Much deeper. The core purpose of existence is to actively know God, to be reconciled from that state of moral brokenness, and to begin reflecting the character of Jesus in everyday life.
Which leads us directly to the absolute, non-negotiable center of gravity for this entire movement. The one phrase you will hear in every single one of these churches across the globe.
The concept of being born again.
Yes.
It is impossible to overstate the importance of that phrase, and it represents a massive historical paradigm shift in how religion functions sociologically.
Tell me more about that.
Well, for centuries, across much of the world, religion was functionally identical to your nationality.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it was deeply tied to geography and bloodline. If you were born in France in the 16th century, you were Catholic. If you were born in Russia, you were Orthodox. It was an inherited cultural identity, cemented by the sacraments you received from the moment of your birth.
So you didn't really choose it. It was just the water you swam in.
Exactly. It was just assumed. But the born-again framework completely demolishes that idea. This movement insists that you absolutely cannot inherit salvation.
So it doesn't matter what your parents did.
Not at all. It doesn't matter if your parents were the most devout Christians on earth. It doesn't matter if you grew up sitting in a church pew every single Sunday. You are not automatically included. The system requires a deliberate, highly personal, individual moment of surrender and salvation through faith in Jesus alone.
You have to actively cross the threshold yourself. No one can carry you over.
And that emphasis on individual choice perfectly aligned with the rise of modern individualism, particularly in the West. It made religion a matter of personal agency rather than geographical fate.
But wait, let's look at the actual logistics of this.
Okay.
Because this is where the whole decentralized structure seems like it should just implode.
Logistically speaking.
Yeah. You have a movement built entirely on cutting out middle management.
Yeah.
You say the Bible alone is the final authority, but you have millions of independent, totally autonomous local churches and tens of millions of individuals all reading the exact same ancient manual.
Right.
But there is no central HR department. There is no Supreme Court to enforce interpretations. Doesn't that inherently lead to absolute chaos and massive conflict?
It is the Achilles heel of the entire system.
I knew it.
When you strive for ultimate theological simplicity relying only on a single text, you inadvertently create massive, inescapable logistical complexity.
Because everyone reads it differently.
Exactly. Human beings reading an ancient, complex text are never going to agree on exactly what it means. Without a pope or a central council to step in and say, stop arguing this is the definitive official interpretation of this chapter, disputes inevitably multiply and fracture the community.
Let me give you a practical example of this that's in this research. What happens when an independent church in Texas reads a passage about church leadership and decides the text clearly says only men can be pastors?
Right.
But an independent church in California reads the exact same passage, looks at the historical context, and decides, no, the text actually supports women in leadership. Who breaks the tie?
No one breaks the tie.
No one.
They just split. They divide. They build two different buildings, and they start two different churches. And this constant, unending mitosis is why the internal diversity of the non-denominational movement is staggering to sociologists. From the outside, media and political commentators often treat evangelicalism as a single monolithic block.
Like they all agree on everything.
Right. But from the inside, it is a kaleidoscope of conflicting cultures and interpretations.
Right. You can drive down a street in any major American city and see this. You might walk into one non-denominational church that is essentially a quiet, highly intellectual, deeply reformed Bible study center.
With very subdued music.
Exactly. The music is subdued. The sermon is like a 50-minute academic lecture on ancient Greek translations, and the congregation takes furious notes.
Yes. And then you walk 2 blocks down the street into another non-denominational church, and it is a high-energy, charismatic, Pentecostal space.
Total opposite vibe.
Total opposite. People are weeping, openly, speaking in tongues, praying intensely for miraculous physical healings, and treating the text as a living prophetic document rather than an academic one.
But they both claim the same authority.
They both emphatically claim to operate entirely on sola scriptura. But their independent interpretations have created two vastly different sociological realities.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The physical spaces themselves, the architecture of these realities, is where this movement truly innovated. Because when you shift the authority away from an ancient, centralized institution and place it directly into the hands of local, independent communities, you completely transform the physical environment of how human beings gather.
The contrast in the sociology of space is just profound.
Give us a picture of that.
Well, think about the architecture of a traditional Catholic or Orthodox cathedral. Everything about that physical space is engineered to make the individual human feel small in the presence of the ancient and the divine.
Right, the vaulted ceilings drawing your eyes up.
Exactly. The vaulted ceilings draw your eyes up to heaven. The stained glass filters the light to feel otherworldly. The heavy scent of incense. The massive stone altars.
And the entire focus of that room is the altar, because that is where the sacraments happen. In the Catholic tradition, you have 7 sacraments, things like confirmation, penance, the anointing of the sick, and these are viewed as literal, mystical channels of divine grace.
Right. God is physically interacting with humanity through those specific ancient rituals performed by an ordained priest.
But the evangelical and non-denominational model aggressively strips those 7 sacraments down to just 2, baptism and communion.
And crucially, they fundamentally change what those acts mean. The vast majority of these independent churches do not view baptism and communion as mystical channels of grace that are required to save your soul.
So what are they?
They view them as powerful, deeply meaningful, but ultimately symbolic acts of obedience and faith.
They are outward expressions of an inward reality.
Exactly. Baptism is the public declaration of that born-again choice we discussed earlier. It's the individual saying to the community, I have made this choice. Communion is an act of remembering the sacrifice of Jesus, not the literal physical consumption of his body and blood.
And if you remove the mystical necessity of the sacraments, you no longer need the massive stone altar.
Right.
And if you no longer need the altar, you no longer need the ancient cathedral. So what do you replace it with?
You replace it with functional, adaptable entrepreneurial spaces. You replace it with startup culture.
And that startup culture is the exact engine that birthed the megachurch phenomenon. This is what happens when a religious movement operates like a decentralized tech sector.
It really is.
When you have total local autonomy and there is no central bureaucracy telling a pastor how fast they are allowed to grow, where they are allowed to plant a new building, or what their budget should be, innovation spreads like an absolute wildfire.
These megachurches are fascinating ecosystems. They operate with a level of sophistication that genuinely rivals major corporations, because the goal is to reach as many people as possible. Remember, Billy Graham's mandate for mass evangelism. They engineer their spaces to lower the barrier to entry for the modern, secular individual.
Walk us through those spaces, because they are incredibly deliberate. If someone who has never been to church walks into a cathedral, they are instantly intimidated.
Oh, totally.
They don't know the rituals. They don't know when to kneel. They don't know the Latin phrases. It feels like a private club they don't belong to.
But if that same secular person walks into a modern megachurch, they are walking into an environment that is deeply familiar to them.
Like a mall or a theater.
Exactly. They walk through the doors and they see a high-end coffee shop. They see modern typography and branding. The sanctuary doesn't have wooden pews. It has comfortable stadium-style seating.
And the lighting.
Yes, the lighting is often intentionally dimmed, and the focus is on a massive professional broadcast quality stage with LED screens.
That dim lighting is actually a massive psychological tool, isn't it?
It is entirely strategic. When you dim the lights in a massive auditorium of, say, 5,000 people, you create a localized sense of anonymity.
Interesting.
The person who is exploring faith for the first time, who might be carrying a massive amount of personal shame or uncertainty, doesn't feel like they're being watched by their neighbors.
Right, they aren't exposed.
Exactly. They feel insulated in the dark, which ironically allows them to become much more emotionally vulnerable and receptive to the message.
And the tool used to break open that emotional vulnerability is, without question, the music.
Oh, the music is everything.
The music isn't just a warm-up act for the sermon. It's the absolute heartbeat of the megachurch ecosystem. We're talking about abandoning the ancient choirs and the pipe organs entirely and replacing them with contemporary stadium rock bands.
The sociology of modern worship music is honestly a study in emotional engineering. You have global music outfits, groups like Hillsong out of Australia, Bethel Music in California, or artists like Chris Tomlin, who essentially write the soundtrack for the entire global movement.
Yeah, you hear the same songs everywhere.
Exactly. And they write these songs with incredibly specific chord progressions, swelling crescendos, and highly repetitive, deeply emotive lyrics that are projected on massive screens so every single person in the room can sing along.
It's a participatory concert, but it goes deeper than that. Let's pull that thread and go back to the freestyle cipher analogy we used at the start.
Okay, let's do it.
In a rap cipher, the energy relies entirely on one specific type of content to keep the crowd engaged. It relies on the absolute, raw authenticity of the personal story. If you step into a cipher and you spit fake manufactured lines, the crowd turns on you instantly.
They'll boo you right out.
Exactly. The entire currency of the circle is vulnerability.
And that exact same currency drives the psychological worldview of the evangelical movement. Sociologists refer to this as testimony culture.
Testimony culture.
In this context, a testimony is the deeply ingrained practice of sharing a highly personal, deeply vulnerable story about how God intervened in your actual messy life.
Is a narrative proof of the theology. You aren't standing up and reciting an ancient abstract creed about the dual nature of Christ. You are standing up with a microphone and saying, 2 years ago, I was struggling with a severe, crippling addiction that destroyed my marriage. Or, I was facing a total emotional collapse and a complete loss of identity. Or, I had all the money in the world, but I was entirely devoid of purpose and secretly suicidal. And here is how a very real, personal encounter with Jesus fundamentally rewired my brain and saved my life.
What's fascinating here is that it functions just like art. Think of it like an independent artist, say, a musician writing a deeply personal, autobiographical concept album.
Actually, the sources use a highly specific analogy for this. The author compares this testimony culture to a fictional musician named Mac writing a deeply personal album for Root Beer Records.
Oh, right, the Root Beer Records analogy.
Yeah, and for you listening, the point of that analogy is to illustrate this universal human instinct. When Mac the musician takes his own private pain, his struggles with identity, his failures, and he metabolizes all of that trauma into a brilliant piece of music, it resonates.
Because it's universally human.
Because it's real. We all have this deep-seated, desperate need to take the chaos, the pain, and the seemingly random suffering of our private lives and weave it into a narrative that has profound meaning.
And testimony culture provides the exact framework for that meaning. If you analyze the psychological arc of these testimonies, they almost universally follow an ancient, deeply resonant pattern: fall, redemption, transformation, and purpose.
It is the classic hero's journey, but it is entirely democratized.
Completely democratized.
Break that down a bit more. How does that arc specifically appeal to the modern individual?
Well, in the modern, highly secularized world, one of the greatest psychological epidemics we face is a profound sense of alienation and meaninglessness.
People just feel lost.
They feel like they are just a random collection of atoms floating on a rock in a cold universe, and their suffering has no point. But testimony culture offers a radical counter-narrative. It tells the individual that their life, no matter how messy, how broken, or how ordinary, has cosmic, eternal significance.
It takes an individual's deep, private suffering, and by sharing it openly in this authenticity culture that prizes emotional honesty above almost everything else, it transforms that private pain into communal strength.
Yes.
Like if I share my story of addiction, it isn't just a shameful secret anymore. It becomes a tool that might save the person sitting in the row behind me.
It is a deeply compelling psychological structure. It offers a clear moral framework, a path out of shame, and an instant, fiercely loyal community that supports your transformation.
It's powerful.
And a framework this emotionally resonant, this adaptable, and this deeply tied to the universal human condition was never going to stay confined to just local American suburbs or Midwestern megachurches.
Right. It was designed to scale.
And it scaled with absolute explosive velocity across the entire globe.
This is where the numbers get truly staggering. Non-denominational and evangelical Christianity is currently one of the fastest-growing religious movements on planet Earth. But what is crucial for us to understand is where that growth is happening, because the geographic center of gravity has completely shifted.
The explosive growth is primarily occurring in the global south and the east. Let's look at sub-Saharan Africa, for instance.
Okay.
The movement there is massive, and it thrives because the decentralized nature of evangelicalism allows it to perfectly map onto local cultures.
How does it do that in Africa?
In many parts of Africa, there is a deep cultural belief in the active, daily reality of the spiritual world, that spiritual forces affect physical health, finances, and daily life. The Pentecostal and charismatic wings of this movement speak directly to that, offering a theology of spiritual warfare, physical healing, and sometimes the prosperity gospel, which promises material blessing through faith.
And then you cross the ocean to Latin America, which has historically been the absolute stronghold of the centralized Catholic Church for centuries. What is happening there?
You are seeing a massive, unprecedented shift. Millions of people across Brazil, Guatemala, and throughout Latin America are leaving traditional Catholicism and joining evangelical and Pentecostal startups.
Why the mass exodus?
Because while the historic Catholic parish might feel distant or bureaucratic, the local evangelical church operates like an intense, hyper-local mutual aid society. It offers immediate community, highly emotional and culturally resonant music, and a direct sense of personal empowerment that appeals deeply to marginalized or working-class populations.
And then you have South Korea, which presents a completely different sociological backdrop.
Right, a nation that modernized very quickly.
Exactly. You have a nation that modernized and industrialized at breakneck speed following the Korean War. And alongside that rapid economic modernization, you had the explosion of massive Presbyterian and evangelical megachurches.
With very intense discipline.
Yeah, they incorporated incredible structures of discipline like early morning prayer meetings and massive prayer mountains where thousands gather to pray. The religion provided a stabilizing, highly organized community structure during a period of massive national upheaval.
But perhaps the most fascinating global example of why this decentralized structure works is China.
Oh, the underground churches.
Yes. The evangelical movement forms the backbone of the massive underground house church networks in China.
This is where the lack of a pope or a central headquarters becomes a literal survival mechanism.
Precisely. Think about it. If you are an authoritarian state looking to control or crush a religious movement, a centralized institution is an easy target.
You just arrest the leaders.
You arrest the leaders, seize the headquarters, shut down the seminaries. The body dies because you cut off the head. But the house church movement in China operates entirely like a hydra.
You cut off one head.
And there is no central headquarters to target. It is a vast, invisible network of millions of people gathering in small apartments, living rooms, and secret locations.
If the state discovers and shuts down one house church, 3 more pop up in the neighboring apartment buildings.
Because they don't need a highly educated, state-approved priest to run the service. They just need a Bible, a small group of believers, and the shared conviction of their faith. The theology's minimal requirements make it virtually indestructible by state force.
Which represents a massive historical irony. The research points out that evangelicalism went from being a persecuted historical minority in Europe during the centuries of state-run churches to becoming a dominant, highly visible cultural and political force in the United States.
And now globally, it exists in this complex tension. It is exploding in numerical growth, yet it often faces intense political and social persecution in places like China, Iran, and parts of the Middle East.
But let's bring it back to the West, and specifically the United States. Because when a grassroots movement reaches this scale, when it numbers in the tens of millions, it inevitably, unavoidably intersects with massive social and political power. It cannot exist in a vacuum.
And the reality of that interaction is incredibly complex. If we look at this strictly from a sociological perspective, the data shows 2 very distinct realities.
Let's hear them.
On a social and humanitarian level, these decentralized networks are massive drivers of global charity. Because they operate with the speed and agility of a startup, they can mobilize millions of dollars and thousands of volunteers for international disaster relief, orphan care, and immense global missionary operations faster than many government agencies.
But on the political front, particularly in American politics, their influence is undeniable and heavily debated. And I want to be very clear for you listening. We are impartially reporting the sociological data here from the sources. We are not taking a stance.
Right, just analyzing the data.
But the data outlines their massive involvement in right-wing political activism. They have been foundational in organizing the pro-life movement, fighting intense legal battles over religious freedom, and shaping conservative family policy. But there's a massive misconception here that we need to clarify.
The misconception is the idea that this movement is a politically monolithic voting bloc.
Everyone assumes they all vote the exact same way.
Exactly. Outsiders often assume that because they share a theology, they share a singular political agenda. But the reality of decentralization proves otherwise. Because there is no pope dictating a unified political platform, the movement is wildly diverse.
You have massive megachurches in the American South that are deeply conservative and heavily involved in traditional Republican politics. But simultaneously, you have massive non-denominational churches in urban centers like Los Angeles, New York, or Atlanta that are culturally progressive.
Completely different political focus.
Their theology drives them to be heavily focused on racial reconciliation, environmental stewardship, immigration reform, and left-leaning social justice initiatives.
They are reading the exact same Bible, but the localized, independent nature of their interpretation leads them to entirely different political conclusions.
So what does this all mean? That intense friction, the constant clash of politics, culture, and independent theology, brings us to the flip side of this rapid growth. Because just as millions of people are drawn into the movement every year, the data details exactly why a massive number of people are currently deciding to leave it.
Yes, the phenomenon of deconstruction.
Deconstruction is becoming just as much a part of the culture as conversion.
The exodus is very real, and the reasons are deeply tied to the structural flaws we've been discussing. For many, the exit is directly triggered by that political entanglement. People walk away because they feel the core, simple theology of Jesus has been entirely eclipsed by harsh, partisan political maneuvering.
They feel the movement traded its spiritual authenticity for political power.
Exactly. But it isn't just politics. Often the exit is deeply intellectual. The absolute reliance on a literal reading of the Bible eventually collides with modern complexities.
Like what?
Well, people begin asking deep questions regarding how to reconcile a literal interpretation of Genesis with modern scientific consensus on evolution. Or they study historical critical methods and realize the Bible was compiled over thousands of years by multiple authors, and they can no longer accept it as a single, perfectly dictated manual without contradictions.
And when they bring those complex intellectual questions to a system that prizes simple black and white certainty,
They're often met with defensiveness rather than dialogue, which pushes them right out the door.
there is also the issue of sheer exhaustion. When every single local church can interpret the text independently, you get endless, bitter, internal disputes.
It's exhausting.
Churches split over debates surrounding predestination versus free will. They split over what kind of music to play. They split over the pastor's salary. For the average person sitting in the pew, the constant splintering and lack of unified stability can lead to severe spiritual burnout.
And ironically, some people leave the movement because the movement actually succeeded too well at its original goal.
What do you mean?
It succeeded completely at cutting out the ancient traditions and the historical bureaucracy. But eventually, a subset of people look around the high-tech megachurch. They look at the stadium seating, the laser lights, the coffee shop, and the rock band, and they feel a profound sense of shallowness.
They realize they have traded the transcendent for the entertaining.
Exactly. They say, I want something older than my pastor's latest podcast. I want the quiet. I want the mystery. I want the deep, unbroken historical continuity of the ancient liturgy.
They want the cathedral back.
They do. And we are seeing a fascinating sociological pendulum swing where these individuals actually convert back to traditional Catholicism or Eastern Orthodoxy. The craving for historical roots is just as strong a human instinct as the craving for modern, authentic expression.
So if you step back and look at this entire sprawling, chaotic, deeply emotional ecosystem, you have to ask, how does it survive? How does a movement dealing with massive debates over women in leadership, intense clashes over science and politics, and an endless cycle of people deconstructing their faith, not just completely collapse under its own weight?
The survival mechanism is entirely due to its core design feature, which sociologists call theological minimalism.
Theological minimalism.
By constantly stripping the absolute requirements of the faith down to the barest essentials, the authority of the Bible, the central saving figure of Jesus, and the mandate to evangelize the movement remains incredibly light.
It's agile.
Very agile. It travels well. It doesn't require the infrastructure of a European cathedral, the hierarchy of a Roman bureaucracy, or a highly educated priesthood to function. It just needs a text, a group of willing people, and the shared emotional experience of belief. That extreme minimalism allows it to adapt, survive, and replicate in literally any culture, any language, and any era.
It is the ultimate plug-and-play religious framework. So to synthesize this entire journey for you, the listener, we have traced this movement from its rebellious, institution-shattering roots in the Protestant Reformation, right through the gritty, emotional tent revivals of the 1700s, past the massive logistical stadium crusades of Billy Graham, all the way to its current status.
It's a massive journey.
It is a global, entrepreneurial, highly adaptable, emotion-driven powerhouse, built entirely on the code of the Bible and powered by the raw cipher energy of personal testimony.
And regardless of where you stand personally, whether you hold these theological beliefs deeply or whether you're viewing this entirely from the outside, as a secular observer, understanding this movement is absolutely essential.
Absolutely.
It is a masterclass in human sociology. It proves that community, deeply vulnerable narrative storytelling, and extreme structural adaptability can build a worldwide ecosystem from the ground up, surviving and thriving against all historical odds.
It truly is a masterclass. But before we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought. Something to really mull over that extrapolates on everything we've unpacked today.
Oh, lay it on us.
The ultimate superpower of this decentralized movement has always been its ability to perfectly adapt its core message to whatever the current cultural medium is, right?
Right.
In the 1500s, they adapted to the printing press, democratizing the Bible. In the 1950s, they mastered radio and television. Today, they have completely dominated the digital age with broadcast-quality live streams, sophisticated podcast networks, and highly curated social media platforms.
They survive because they are always the early adopters of the newest medium.
Exactly.
Oh.
But here is the critical question. What happens when the cultural medium fundamentally shifts away from the physical world entirely and moves into virtual reality, or becomes dominated by artificial intelligence?
Oh, wow.
We just spent an hour unpacking a theology that is built entirely on genuine emotional human connection, physical presence, and the raw, deeply vulnerable authenticity of an individual's personal testimony.
The cipher energy.
Right. So how does a movement that relies on looking a fellow human being in the eye, seeing their tears, and hearing them share their deepest pain, adapt to a post-physical, entirely synthetic world?
That's a huge question.
If you put on a headset and listen to a perfectly articulated, algorithmically generated testimony from an AI avatar, does it still carry the currency of authenticity? Can an AI pastor giving a flawlessly tailored sermon trigger a genuine born-again psychological experience? Or will this hyper-adaptable movement finally hit a medium it simply cannot remix? Think about it. We'll catch you on the next deep dive.